Julie, everyone. I'm really excited and honored to have with us today as our speaker, Ms. Helena Norberg Hodge. Helena Norberg, also known as Ache Helen Dolmale, is a pioneer of the local economy movement. She is an author and a filmmaker. Helena is the founder and director of Local Futures. Local Futures, previously known as the International Society for Ecology and Culture, is a non-profit organization that, I quote, examines the root causes of our current social and economic environmental crisis while promoting more sustainable and equitable patterns of living, both north and south, unquote. For more than 4 decades, her organization has been working towards, I quote, renewing ecological, social, and spiritual well-being by promoting a shift in direction away from dependence on global monopolies and towards decentralized local and regional economies, unquote. An activist and a critic of economic globalization, she co-founded the International Forum on Globalization in 1994 and with other prominent individuals from around the world, and the International Alliance for Localization in 2014. Helena is also the founding member of International Commission of the Future of Food and Agriculture and Global Eco-Village Network, founded in 1991. Educated in Sweden, Germany, Austria, England, and United States, she specializes in linguistics, including studies at the University of London and at MIT. She speaks 7 languages, one of them being Ladakhi. About her journey in Ladakh, she first visited Ladakh in 1975 to work for a documentary film wherein she started learning the language, and in the following years, along with John Page, they founded the Ladakh Project in 1978. Ladakh, then a remote region of India, was opening up to development and tourism. In the 70s, the project provided the people here with information about the impact of conventional development in other parts of the world and explored more sustainable patterns of local development based on the use of Ladakhi's own local knowledge and resources. She also helped in setting up several other NGOs like the Ladakh Ecology and Development Group Ladakh in 1983, Women's Alliance in 1990, and Ladakh Environment and Health Organization in 1991. In 1986, Ladakh and Helena, sorry, in 1986, Helena and Ladakh shared the Right Livelihood Award, also commonly known as the Alternative Nobel Prize. And in 2012, she was awarded the prestigious Goy Peace Award. In the course of time, in 1988, Helena's seminal work, Ancient Futures Learning from Ladakh, was published in Sweden and Denmark, and it was first published in English in 1991. Her book is based on her first-hand experience of Ladakh's rich traditional culture and the impacts of conventional development on it. It has been translated into more than 40 languages and sold about 500,000 copies with the film version of the same. Helena is also a filmmaker and has produced and co-directed the award-winning documentary The Economics of Happiness in 2011, along with John Page, where she lays out her arguments against economic globalization and for localization. Her most recently published books, Local is Our Future, Steps to an Economics of Happiness, 2019, outlines how a systemic economic shift from global to local can address the world's social, ecological, spiritual crisis. And her second book, co-authored, titled Bringing the Food Economy Home, Local Alternatives to Global Agribusiness, was published in 2002. And today we have her here to speak about her work in the context of the ongoing Ladakh Literature Festival 2020. And thank you. We would like to invite Helena to speak now. Thank you.
All right. Well, I'm very happy to be able to speak at the Ladakh Literary Festival. As many people know, Ladakh became my life. I came to Ladakh just after it had opened up in 1975. I learned to speak the language fluently, and I encountered people who were happier and healthier than any people I had ever met. I was coming out as part of a film team. I was only going to be there for 6 weeks. And they had brought me as a linguist, as someone who learns languages quickly, and because they thought they wouldn't be able to communicate with people. And I started learning a lot of the language. And by the time the film was finished, I was quite fluent actually. And I decided to stay on after the film was finished. That was after 6 weeks. And I went through the region. I was collecting folk stories. I was going to do a PhD on Ladakhi. And I also helped to start a rudimentary Ladakhi dictionary, writing down Ladakhi, not Tibetan. And in the process, I walked through the entire region. I never, ever met a single person who said to me, "We are so poor and backward. You need to help us." Never. On the contrary, people said, "Have you tasted all our delicious food?" Which I didn't always find so delicious, but I loved Ladakh and I loved the people. And I saw that as the area was being opened to development, it was being opened by the Indian government to a process of Western style development that was all based on fossil fuels. So it was thrown open to the global economy. Ladakh had had its own local economy for thousands of years. The houses were made of the mud and the poplar and the willows, of local materials. People were still weaving their own clothes, dyeing them from local herbs. The diet was local and it was rich. People were healthy. I never saw any signs of the modern illnesses that came later, like heart disease, like strokes, like diabetes. Of course, there was high infant mortality, there's no doubt about that, but this was in a context where people were actually so secure in their extended family and in their community relationships that it wasn't the same tragedy that it is for modern people in their little nuclear family. However, some people will argue that places like Ladakh have to be developed because of high infant mortality. And if we don't look at the overall cost to the entire economy, to the culture, to people's happiness, to their health, then we might think that yes, it's worth the price. I would argue that it's definitely not worth the price, particularly because we started demonstrating already in the late 70s that it was possible to meet the modern world and to introduce certain technologies based on renewable energy that could create more comfort, that could create a bit more of a shield between people and nature without sacrificing the entire culture, the entire economy, and the environment. So we started the Ladakh Ecological Development Group, and I was very happy that Ladakh's leaders, most of their leaders, joined that group. However, I also realized very early on that if there wouldn't be more understanding in the West, if Westerners would continue to assume that they had figured everything out and that their wealth and their culture was superior to Ladakhi culture. If that continued, Ladakh wouldn't really stand a chance. So very early on, I started traveling to the West, to America, to Europe, all later on Japan, Korea, all over the world, to try to raise awareness about the way that the global economic system is actually having a destructive effect worldwide. I don't know of a single country today where the gap between rich and poor is not growing to obscene proportions. We can see billionaires who now have hundreds of billions. We are really long overdue in recognizing that we must make economic change if we want not only to have healthier, happier people, but if we want to survive. So, what became very clear to me early on was that this was essentially a battle between the global economic system and local economies all around the world. I saw that even in my native country of Sweden, the global forces were coming in, introducing an Americanized consumer monoculture, making children already aged 3 or 4 feel that their culture was inferior, making everyone around the world believe if you don't speak English, you are nobody. So if I hadn't in Ladakh seen this extreme shift, if I hadn't been engaging with Ladakhis who were the most deeply self-respecting people I had ever met, I never encountered people who were so secure in who they were, who didn't feel embarrassed and self-conscious, didn't feel they had to posture and pose to be something other than who they were. I discovered without a doubt the healthiest people, psychologically speaking, of any people I had ever encountered. I spoke 7 languages, I had traveled to many countries, and seeing the changes that came strengthened this perspective because I saw how people who had the strongest self esteem, within a matter of years, the psychological warfare of a global consumer culture made young children in Ladakh feel that their culture wasn't good enough, that they were backward and stupid, that, as people would say, boom bootsoxin, we don't speak the language, we're like donkeys. And this was completely new, it was the opposite of what the Ladakhis had been like. So I became, even more motivated to raise awareness about what I call the economics of happiness. What are the economics of happiness? They are economies where people are allowed worldwide to feel that their culture, their language, their traditions are perfectly valid. This is not about closing off, building some big wall around Ladakh, shutting down communication with the outside world. On the contrary, we sponsored Ladakhis to come to the West to see with their own eyes what life in the West was actually like. They were getting a completely misleading impression that we didn't do any work, that we had infinite wealth, that we were, you know, oh so happy and oh so much leisure. They had no idea that we were working much harder than the average Ladakhi. And I mean much harder, running faster and faster and faster, and never feeling like we had enough time. We had all kinds of health problems, and especially mental health problems. That when I used to say to the Ladakhis, in the West, which is supposed to be such a success, we actually now have doctors who are only concerned with our mental well being. We have something called depression. It was long, long conversations in Ladakh before people could understand at all what I was talking about. They just didn't believe me. Why would you need a doctor for your mental health? As you all know, in Ladakh, this has changed dramatically. And now there's suicide, at least one a month, and very often among young people. All of us, outsiders as well as Ladakhis, really need to step back, take a deep breath, and try to understand why is this? What has happened? And as I said earlier, I saw that it had to do with this almost like warfare from the global economic forces influencing local peoples and local economies. When all around the world you get through media a consumer monoculture beamed into every house, and I saw it in Mongolia, I saw it among the Maasai, all around the world, you are creating a type of psychological warfare against young children. And as those children see these images that look like people are so happy and they look different from me, and I'm, in the beginning in Ladakh, it was all white skin, blonde hair, blue eyes. Now that consumer culture has changed. You're allowed to have dark skin, you can have brown eyes, you can even be Asian looking or African, but the message is still, if you don't live in the city, if you don't have a fancy car, if you're not part of this power elite, you are nobody. So we still have forces going on that are even more insidious. And we need to have those deeper conversations that we facilitated with some Ladakhi leaders, in fact, quite a few we sponsored to come to Europe and America, to really have a deeper understanding of the fact that around the world we're all facing the same issues, and that we really need to collaborate together internationally to support one another in maintaining respect for our own identities. Above all, it's about maintaining respect for the local. To see that if we want to survive, we need to protect biological diversity. And the way that we did that for generations was through more local, experiential knowledge. We had languages and ways of observing our environment that allowed that maintenance of the local fabric. When most basic needs were met from local regions around the world, the ecological footprint was minimal. Cultures were able to sustain themselves for generations. Now, what I saw so clearly in Ladakh was that fundamentally, the global economy doesn't just romanticize urban consumer living, but it pushes people into urban centers. So there's a structural link between this monoculture and the push away from farming, away from the land. And as people through schooling and most of our education, even at university, especially at university, we are trained for jobs that have been held in urban centers. They've been linked to so-called cheap oil, but the oil was never cheap. We fought wars over it. It led to most of the world wars, and the wars we've had have been over resources, because this global development path increases the ecological footprint massively. And it doesn't do that by improving our living. It does it by increasing profits to fewer and fewer billionaires. Now, we're getting to the point where we all need to work together to support the strengthening of local economies. Ladakh is a very important leader in that movement. It's certainly what shaped my thinking. It's what gave me like a roadmap towards a healthier world. It's a world that I called ancient futures. We need to learn basic principles from ancient indigenous culture to take the fundamental structures into the future. And they have to do with human scale institutions. They have to do with more holistic knowledge, holistic, interdisciplinary, and place-based knowledge as a priority. They have to do with intergenerational community, not segregating our children into separate age groups. It's a disaster. It creates divisiveness and competition and insecurity. They have to do with a deeper contact with nature, an ongoing deeper contact. They have to do with a balance between urban and rural. Urgently, we need to support people to either stay on the land as farmers or to go back to the land. Not everyone needs to be a farmer, but we need to maintain respect and make sure that people who do the work of producing food have the respect and the remuneration that they deserve. In fact, I often try to explain that the only thing that humans produce that every person needs every day of their life is food. Raising the status of farmers is more important than maintaining the status of engineers, doctors, lawyers, the professions that are now considered very important. Healthy food is fundamental to health. Healthy food is fundamental to maintaining biodiversity and the health of ecosystems. Localized, healthy organic food economies are the way to reduce the emissions that have led to climate change. Currently, we have countries importing and exporting the same foodstuff. The US exports 1.5 billion tons of beef and turns around and imports 1.5 billion tons of beef. The UK exports as much milk and butter as it imports. On a daily basis, around the world, from Norway, from America, from Australia, fish is flown to China to be processed and flown back again on a daily basis. Apples are flown from England to South Africa to be washed, flown back again. The global food economy is the biggest contributor to climate change. And because the giant farms that fuel this global supermarket economy can only produce in monoculture, bigger and bigger monoculture, just one thing. No diversity, no adapted species, either of seeds or animals. These monocultures are destroying the soil, destroying the water, at that time, the Ladakhis were producing more than 3 tons per hectare of wheat and barley as well, but we did wheat. In America at that time, the average yield using all the artificial fertilizers and the big machinery and all that were lower than that. But now, because this chemical industrial agriculture has destroyed the soil so badly, the yields are going down further and even collapsing. So we have many, many reasons why we need to learn from Ladakh and why we need to support a more diversified, localized economic development and regain a balance between urban and rural, between global and local. Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be with you today.
Thank you so much, Helena. I have a few questions regarding your presentation, and even in general, I'm sure the readers would, the viewers, I'm sorry, would love to learn more about that. So since you talked about the local versus the global versus the local economy, and you are an advocate of the, you are the pioneer of the local economy movement. So my first question towards you is, what is your, in the context of Ladakh, what is your model of development, or the term yarges that we call, and wherein development defined by our local administration or the local people here is more to do with the infrastructural development, you see. So I wanted to understand, from your experience, what is development or the model of development for this region is, or how do we interpret the idea of development? Yeah.
Well, it is very tricky. As I said, one of the first things that should be looked at in Ladakh is the destruction of agriculture. And that means there should be major efforts put into supporting people who are still farming, supporting the young people who would like to farm. Because in Ladakh, like everywhere else, there is a micro trend of young people who would like to go back to farming. That I would say is the number one issue, how to support those young people who want to go back to farming. The second issue is really that all the infrastructure development should be based on renewable energy. But we now have a problem because there is a sort of a large scale Green New Deal that is arguing that we can keep transporting things back and forth, back and forth. We just need to have mega solar plantations and giant windmill farms. No, we need to look at reducing the energy that we're using in needless transport and trade. So the emphasis in Ladakh should be on increasing the productivity there. There should be a big push to try to stay with the adobe or mud architecture, but make the adjustments as we demonstrated with glass in the windows, perhaps with a bit more reduction in dust. But the basic building materials should be Ladakhi. We should not be looking at trying to turn the desert into some kind of plantation, but where trees were planted, they need to be replanted as they always were traditionally. And the local economy, you have to be careful that it doesn't just become objects for sale to tourists. That's not maintaining the local economy. You want to try to have the basics, the food, the clothing, the shelter coming from Ladakh for people who live in Ladakh the year round. Ideally, you want to learn from Bhutan and limit the number of tourists to maintain a high quality experience, both for the Ladakhis and for the tourists. When you have endless numbers pouring in, inevitably you will have resentment and antagonism and a degraded environment and a degraded culture. So those are some of the elements that we would recommend.
Right, thank you. Now that we have all been hit by COVID-19 pandemic, so as an observer, I have seen a lot of changes in the trends when it comes to the local economy and how young entrepreneurs are, Ladakhi entrepreneurs are taking up or stepping up towards producing locally. You will be happy to know that there are many startups here. I'm sure you must be aware of it already, but who are producing a lot of items which focuses on generating of course self-employment. At the same time, they are generating employment for others and also focusing on making sure that the environment is not affected that much. And the whole while I was reading your book, I went across the era when the Indian government brought about a lot of subsidies in the form of rice, in form of flour that is still being used or being taken by the Ladakhis. Like during the pandemic, I tried planting my own,
Yeah.
planting vegetables this summer. And not just that, a lot of young people who were not able to go back to college in different parts of India, they went back to agriculture. A lot of young people were, restarting or going back and learning farming. And a lot of initiative have also been taken towards encouraging people to look at agriculture and go back to the traditional knowledge systems and practices that we have here, while at the same time we are keeping up with the modernization that is going on. So how do you see I'm sure you must have friends here, who talk about the changes that are taking place in Ladakh at the moment due to the pandemic. How do you see the world changing or Ladakh in that context changing during the pandemic?
Well, one thing we've seen worldwide, because we're working worldwide now, and we're literally seeing worldwide this turning towards growing your garden, growing your own food, but also we have helped to build up a local food movement around the world. So we've helped to start farmers markets and edible schoolyards and community supported agriculture. Now, all of these schemes, almost without exceptions, help to support people in the crisis and are still. And it was wonderful to see that small farmers supplying to the local farmers market, they were able to increase their production significantly because the people who worked with them were there and they were helpful, they could see the need. In the big supermarket system, they had huge crises because, first of all, in the meat packing plants, it was rampant with COVID. But in other places, they were dependent on migrant labor who were just sort of flown in, a sort of modern type of slave, a little bit like some of the Nepalis and Biharis in Ladakh, actually, because this whole economic system does that. It sucks in poorer people to do the job that local people don't want to do. So anyway, that faced a lot of crises, and these local food economies were real centers of welfare, of inspiration, of community and concern, and local food production. Now, that is something we have been promoting anyway, way before COVID. So we are thrilled to see that now with COVID, the awareness has been, increasing massively. But you were saying that you have been also keeping up with modernity. And I just want to warn about what kind of modernity, because there are these two paths now appearing after COVID. One of them has to do with coming back home to community, to connection to the land, and to who we really are as human beings. We long to be more connected, to have community, and especially more contact between the generations. At the same time, as we're showing the benefit of community, of local food economies, local business alliances, unfortunately, our governments are supporting a path away from that. It's very much linked to war and competition, going off to Mars, using robots to replace people in healthcare, in agriculture, in education. We all need to be discussing the need to adapt technology to society's needs, not to have society shaped by the needs of technology and by the needs of a few billionaires. So this is a very important issue that I hope people will take seriously. Thank you so much. I've really enjoyed having contact with you, and I hope we can stay in touch again and collaborate further.
Sure.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Helena. It was indeed a wonderful presentation, and I think I learned quite a lot from you regarding how we should go forward with the local economy system here in Ladakh, keeping the local businesses and the local food market in mind. In the context of the local economy, since you mentioned that the focus should be on the basics, that is food, shelter, and we could also follow the model of Bhutan, wherein we limit the number of tourists coming to Ladakh to have lesser impact on the region. Uh, so her presentation and the discussion that I had with her gives us a lot of things to think about, to how to go way forward, making sure that we boost our local economy, boost the farming systems here in Ladakh, and also in the context of tourism, how we could go further and adopt more sustainable way of tourism. So thank you again, Helena, for being here and taking out your time. Thank you again.